So I've made an info channel for you guys. It has a link in there to the PDF. I don't know why that university has this book linked publicly, but might as well grab it for free. It's like the home pages dot something Michigan, Western Michigan. I don't know, whatever. And then I've also linked 3 lectures from her that were sort of the lead up to this. It was when she was starting to work on the application of her ethical theory to the problem of other animals. And then even further back from that, there's a paper where she begins to posit some of this stuff, but it's not really fleshed out. Yeah, it's probably worth reading as well. I thought before I began, I'd give like a little bit of context to who Korsgaard is and why she's interesting. The big thing with Korsgaard is that she's a student of a very famous philosopher named John Rawls, who I think if you surveyed quite a few like scholars of law or individuals interested in the philosophy of law, as well as a lot of value theorists, they'd probably say that Rawls has one of the biggest impacts on the American tradition in law and the American tradition in ethics. Pretty famously, he's the guy who comes up with the idea of evaluating morality based on an individual born behind a curtain, with the idea being that something of the sort that like we would want a world such that if we couldn't choose who we were going to be in the world, we'd still be happy with living there. Although, of course, the theory is much more sophisticated than that. As a student of Rawls, she generally takes a turn more into meta-ethics, more so than like any of his other students or even Rawls himself. And so the early component of Korsgaard's career back in like through the 70s through the 80s is really focused on how to posit morality within the context of like a broad skepticism that was happening at the time. And the big thing is that she's looking for a way to ground or to explain where normativity comes from. So she's really interested in like what is it that causes us to be able to say that something is or isn't moral or isn't normative. And she has like a very famous book from 1996 titled The Sources of Normativity, which is a big collection of her views on Kant and how to construct a meta-ethical view. The big thing with Korsgaard is that she's one of the big progenitors of a view in meta-ethics called constructivism, which is sort of seen as like a third positionism, almost away from the very usual conversation of objectivism versus subjectivism. In her view, things like hypothetical normativity and subjectivity are an intrinsic component to figuring out what ethics looks like, but nevertheless, there is some kind of objective moral norms. And so the big thing for her is sort of this binding of how we might learn about normativity or how we might discuss normativity and what the actual norms are. And the big thing with constructivists is that they generally sort of say something like what is moral or what is properly normative is that with which if someone reasoned properly or considered the facts properly, they would discover those norms categorically. Which is just to say, like, just by knowing the things or just by thinking about the things, that in and of itself gives you a reason to do those things. And that to her is where we talk about like shoulds and oughts. An important part of all this is that she's not really an applied ethics person up until she starts talking about animals in 2005 and then further into 2014 and now with this book that came out in 2018. And so the context in which she's writing this is that she's sort of dismayed as she'll talk about in the book, with the field of literature out there on how to talk about animal rights. Because from her perspective, for example, at the time, Peter Singer at the time was a non-cognitivist. Like, he wasn't even a moral realist, and she sort of is wondering what's going on. Like, why isn't there this holistic view that constructs moral realism, or at least something like it, that gives us like the power to talk about animal ethics in a way that's more persuasive than just how people like Singer are talking about it, where it seems to be this like mishmash of sentimentality and the argument from marginal cases. At the same time, Reagan, who is like the original like deontological vegan, and in fact sort of even precedes Singer in talking about animal rights, is sort of in the shadows, and so there's a utility to showcasing some kind of ethics that isn't consequentialist and isn't like subjectivist or anti-real to everyone. And that's sort of like the broad context by which she talks about all this stuff. Ultimately, she doesn't dip in to many of her criticisms of things like consequentialism or anti-realism. Those we would have to go and read her other works for. So they'll be sort of outside of the scope of the book. But at various points, she points out why she thinks that like consequentialists wouldn't be able to answer the problem she's solving, or why like anti-realists wouldn't be able to, or where she thinks they go wrong. The big benefit to this book is that it also can serve as an introduction to constructivism and as an introduction to Kantianism. We'll be reading part 1 first, of course. Part 1 serves as a dialectic that tries to figure out, just based on like our intuitions and based on like the first precepts, whether or not animals should have value that is distinct from humans, and in what context that should be. And then later chapters, so 2 and 3, get a little bit more technical. So we'll see if we hold on to everyone during those parts, where she begins to talk about Kantianism, categorical imperatives, and constructivism and the like. And then finally in part 4 and whatnot, she talks about the applications of this theory. So there's various chapters on, for example, what we should do about animal testing, what we should do about pets, what we should do about predator species, what we should do about eating animals. But that's all way down the road. For the first part, we'll just be reading part 1. And then I'll also do the preface today as well. We're not necessarily going to get through the entirety of part 1 today. We'll just kind of go until people start dropping off, or until it seems like we've like covered like a sufficient amount of ground. And of course, like I don't know if we like want to have people talking in voice chat or like asking questions in voice chat. I'd like to keep it like for clarificatory things. If we want to have like discussions about possible objections and stuff, we should probably keep that to the book discussion chat, as well as maybe like the general voice chat if you guys want to talk about what's going on here. My own personal view right from the outset is not that she's necessarily right, but I think that this serves as a very good counter position, as well as a very good alternative argument to some of the things that people on Discord especially are very acquainted with, which are primarily the arguments from marginal cases, and a view that morality is subjective. So yeah, I'll start with the preface, considering that it seems like that kind of covers everything. Actually, maybe not. The preface just seems to be going over a lot of what I just said and laying out the argument very abstractly. So I'll just let you guys do the preface on your own time if you'd like. So I'll start with part 1, chapter 1, which is entitled, Are People More Important Than the Other Animals? During this reading, I'll be reading out the quotes she provides at the beginning of the chapters, but won't commentate on them, and then I'll also be reading the footnotes as they appear, because generally speaking, her footnotes actually are valuable and do provide a pretty good extension to what she's talking about. So yeah, we'll start with in my book it's page 3. So are people more important than the other animals? We're all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom than to conceive with that distinctiveness, which is no longer reflection but instead feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent center of self, whence the lights and shadow must always fall from a certain difference. I guess I'll say as an aside, I don't really know why she includes this one. Later chapters seem to have more relevant quotes. So 1.1 introduction. We share the world with fellow creatures, but I can't just say that, can I? For we is a word fraught with many assumptions about who's us and who is them, and what the implications of the difference might possibly be. By we, I mean we human beings here, as philosophers usually do. But the fact that I'm using we in this way has more to do with who I am addressing. We human beings, those who can have obligations and can read books that raise questions about what those obligations might be, than about who I am speaking for. For there might be a we that includes all of the animals, and speaks of and acknowledges a fate that we share, and I could have been using that we. That word, share, also embodies some assumptions. You don't share your secret with an eavesdropper, or your house with an intruder, or your land with a colonial oppressor. Although, in all of these cases, he has it and you have it as well. Share suggests something more, that you have something together, that you both have it legitimately, and that you have a common right to it. Therefore, creatures is the word I am going to use when I want to talk about both human beings and the other animals. Now, I could just say animals, since we human beings are also animals, but human and animal are so often used in contrast that we might become confusing. Etymologically, creature suggests a created being, and that might in turn suggest a being created by someone, say for example a god. But the implication I want is not that one, but one traditionally associated with it, especially when creature is used in conjunction with fellow. It is the implication that we are in fact related in something like the way that children of the same family are, just as we would be if we were all children of the same parental god. So almost everything I'd like to convince you of is already contained in this opening phrase. If you have not yet balked at the sentence before I pointed all of this out, I think perhaps I've got a chance. 1.1.2. We share the world with fellow creatures. That is to say, we share the world with other beings who are, to varying degrees, sentient, intelligent, and self-aware. These other creatures find themselves, as we find ourselves, thrown into the world and faced with basic tasks of living, feeding themselves, raising children, and dealing with all the difficulties and dangers that arise from doing these things in a world where others with competing interests are trying to do them too. We eat these fellow creatures, raise them for that purpose in factory farms, we force them to do work for us and live with us, we do experiments on them, we make products out of them, we decide where they may live, we kill them when they interfere with our projects, and we kill or injure or control them for various forms of entertainment and sport. These practices raise, in my mind, some obvious moral questions. In this book, I will address these questions about whether we have any moral obligations to the other animals, what they are, and what the grounds for them are. These are the questions about which philosophers over the centuries have had astonishingly little to say, and that is a fact that is of itself philosophical interest. Until Peter Singer published Animal Liberation in 1975, philosophical treatment of what we owe to the other animals was few and far between. This is especially surprising because the question about how we should treat the other animals is in one important way different from some of the other practical questions that philosophers discuss nowadays. Many of the moral problems that we talk about in philosophy are intended to illustrate the general features of ethical theories and do not actually come up much in everyday life. Others have more practical urgency, but are faced mainly by public officials or perhaps medical doctors. At critical moments of your life, you may face the question about whether or not to have an abortion or to terminate the medical care of a dying loved one. But few of us, as individuals, will ever have to decide whether or not to torture a terrorist who knows the location of a ticking time bomb, although we may have to vote on laws that concern that question. And I am furthermore willing to bet that no one reading this book will ever have to decide whether to push a fat man into the path of a runaway trolley which is barreling towards 5 innocent people tied up on the track. Now, she says an aside here, this is one instance of a category of cases used to test people's moral intuitions that have come up and is called trolley problems. They are cases in which an agent must decide how to respond to a situation in which a runaway trolley is barreling down a track on which a number of people are tied up, and the protagonist may redirect it to another track where others are tied up, or take other morally questionable measures to stop it. These problems are much discussed in moral philosophy and are also used in empirical research in moral psychology. The original example came from Philippa Foot in The Problem of Abortion and the Doctrine of Double Effect. In the case I am referring to, the only way to stop the trolley is to push a fat man onto the track in front of it. This example was offered by Judith Jarvis Thomson in The Trolley Problem. I'm sure most of you just know about those from the memes, but maybe some of you who haven't engaged with the literature don't know the extent to which it actually is like a popular kind of hypothetical in the literature. Both of the books that she mentions there, the Philippa Foot book on abortion and the doctrine of double effect, as well as the Judith Jarvis Thomson, The Trolley Problem essay, are actually worth reading. Philippa Foot is a really interesting philosopher, and the problem or the notion of the doctrine of double effect is a really important one in virtue ethics and in Kantian or deontological ethics that doesn't get talked about much on Discord, surprisingly. So that's like a really good introduction to the notion. And then pretty much everything from Judith Jarvis Thomson I find is really good as an introduction for people who aren't going to school for or don't have much interaction with the literature. She tends to write in a way that a lot of lay people can understand. And a very common example of her work is found in the violinist objection to pro-lifers, where she talks about whether or not it is okay to remove someone from your body who has been attached to it while you're asleep, which I think is probably the most popular or at least controversial paper in the discussion of abortion out there. But anyways, I'll continue. We all make decisions about how to treat the other animals many times every day. When we decide what to eat, what to wear, what medications to take, and what products to use on our bodies, in our homes, and in our gardens. The kinds of decisions that depend on what you think about the issues I treat in this book are decisions you are going to make today. But it's not just their moral urgency that makes it puzzling that philosophers should have so little to say about these questions. It is also that thinking about the other animals and how we are related to them and whether we may kill them, eat them, or experiment on them takes us right into what I consider the existential heart of philosophy. You cannot raise these questions without also taking on questions like these. How and why does death matter? How and why do we, that is, we human beings, matter? Are human beings really just unusually intelligent animals, or is there something distinctively different about us? And if there is, how should that affect the way we treat the other animals? What does it mean to be human? Can it really be true, as people sometimes claim, that human beings are somehow just more important than the other animals? Does that claim even make sense? Thinking about how we stand with respect to our fellow creatures is a way of thinking about the questions that draw most of us into philosophy in the first place, and that makes philosophy itself such an essential part of being what I consider a human. Section 1.2, reasons to treat people and animals differently. Now, in this chapter, I want to start by discussing a view that I think that many people hold, the view that human beings are just more important than the other animals. Most people agree that we have some obligations to the other animals, that we ought to treat them, as we like to say, as quote-unquote humanely as possible. In fact, in the philosophical literature, skinning a cat or setting her on fire as a juvenile prank is one of the standard examples of obviously wrong things. Like torturing babies, another philosophical favorite, it is the kind of example we use when we are looking for something morally uncontroversial so that disputes about the example will not get in the way of the philosophical point. But at the same time, human beings have traditionally countered nearly any reason we might have for hunting or killing animals, short of malicious enjoyment, as outweighing any claims of the animals themselves. We kill non-human animals and sometimes inflict pain on them because we want to eat them, because we can make useful products out of them, because we can learn from experimenting on them, and because they interfere with agriculture or gardening in other ways, or are in other ways pests. We also kill them and sometimes inflict pain and injury on them simply for sport. For example, in hunting, in dogfighting, in horse racing, and so on. So many people seem to believe that animals matter morally, but matter so little that we need never be seriously inconvenienced by the fact. What could possibly justify this? I think that many people assume that animals are simply less important than people, and therefore what happens to them matters less. That's the view that I want to discuss in particular. I think it is wrong. But the problem is not exactly that it is substantively false, that by contrast animals are just as important and valuable as people. The problem is rather that it makes, in my mind, almost no sense at all. Before I explain why, I want to talk about what makes the idea tempting. Let's think about how the differences between people and the other animals might affect the way we ought to treat them. Philosophers nowadays characteristically raise the question whether we have duties to animals by asking whether animals have moral standing. And she notes here that in chapters 5, we're going to talk about what it means to have moral standing. So if that's something that you're not quite getting, or you don't quite know what that means, she's going to talk about it later. Having moral standing is usually thought of as having some property that makes you an appropriate object of direct or intrinsic moral concern. Among the popular choices for this property that confers moral standing are sentience, consciousness, rationality, self-consciousness, personhood, being the subject of a life, and having interests, leaving aside for now the question whether some of those properties are the same or whether they necessarily coincide. So one way in which we might think that the differences between human beings and animals matter is this. We might believe that humans have a property that confers moral standing on us, while the other animals lack that property. In that case, we would have no obligations to the other animals at all. Another way the differences might matter, however, is simply in determining the content of our obligations. Within the human moral community, we owe different things to different people simply because of differences in their natures, or because of other facts about them. For example, we owe gentler treatment to the fragile, or more protection to the vulnerable, or more guidance through the bureaucracy to the illiterate, we might say. It is obvious that even if animals have moral standing, there will be some differences in the ways we treat people and animals that are based on the differences of these kinds. For example, in liberal societies, human beings have a whole range of rights to freedom of speech and of consciousness and of assembly, for example, that are designed to protect our autonomy and our right to live in accordance with our values. We need not concern ourselves with securing these kinds of rights for the other animals who live in accordance with their natures, not in accordance with their values, and so they might lack a kind of autonomy that is protected by such rights. Some of the most urgent questions about how we may treat animals involve differences of this kind. For example, many people believe that it does not matter to a non-human animal in the way it does to a human being how long she lives, or at any given moment whether her life continues. They agree that it matters to an animal that her life should be pleasant and comfortable for as long as it does last, and that she does not suffer pain or unnecessary constraint. And she notes here that she's going to be looking at Peter Singer's cases for this later on in chapter 9, and then later on in chapter 12. The context of her looking at Peter Singer actually is to dispute this and to question where Peter Singer is coming from, and to point out that in her view Peter Singer has like very little ground. But we'll get to that like another day, I think. So continuing on. But they think it does not matter to an animal how long she lives or whether her life should continue from this moment. And then she points out here that these, in her view, somewhat awkward formulations are reflective of the fact that there is philosophical disagreement about whether we should assess the value of length of life from an atemporal perspective or from a temporal point of view within the life. So she's just pointing out that in her mind, the more you dig into animal philosophy or the philosophy of animal rights, the more you're still going to have like these overlaps. And so she's pointing out here, just in her view, that even when it comes to our considerations of humans, we're still not totally sure, maybe from a consequentialist perspective, whether or not the length of the life is what matters, or whether or not it's the value at any given point in the life that matters. And so she just thinks that those questions probably still apply here, but that even if they do apply, they're still kind of weird, which is fair enough. Continuing on, in that case, our only concern about killing her should be whether it is done humanely. So I guess I'll link back. She's just saying there that, like, if it's the case that like time doesn't matter, like the length of a life doesn't matter, it's just the quality of any point. She might draw, for example, on a hypothetical that Peter Singer actually gave his daughter as a kid once, when he was talking to his like not yet adult kid at one point. He mentions that, like, in his view, it's not the amount of time or the length of a life that matters. And therefore, if it were the case that they could kill the family dog and possibly get a new family dog, or multiple family dogs, that might be better. And so sometimes this emerges as a kind of like anti-vegan argument, where people point out that the purpose to veganism is to humanely raise animals such that we can have like more of them having a life that is at minimum worth living, and that the length of their life doesn't matter at all. Like the fact that we kill many of these creatures when developmentally they're effectively like 1 to 2 years in human years, it just like it wouldn't matter on that view. So she's just pointing out that she thinks that might be a bit silly. Anyways, but continuing to live does matter to human beings who have projects to carry out, relationships we want to maintain, loved ones we want to stay with, and various milestones we hope to meet. For myself, I think that in many cases, the continuation of life might in fact matter more to a human being than to another animal for reasons of this kind. But she points out that she disagrees with herself here actually later on. I think that the absence of those reasons does not mean that a longer life is not better for an animal than a shorter one, provided it is otherwise good. Obviously, this is an important question because it bears on the issue whether or not killing animals when they are still young enough to make for good eating can be made morally acceptable by treating them humanely during their lives and then killing them in what they might consider a merciful way. So even if animals have moral standing, the differences between people and animals can lead to important differences in what counts as treating them acceptably or not. I have just described two very different ideas. The idea that there is a difference in moral standing between people and animals, and the idea that we have different kinds of duties to people and animals because of differences in their natures or other facts about them. I think, however, that many people tend to run these two different ideas together and to conclude that animals have moral standing but have less of it than people, and that animals are, in some general sense, therefore less important than people. That's a confusion. Suppose, for example, you do believe that it is all right to kill an animal so long as you do it humanely. If the reason you believe that if the reason you believe that is that you think that an ongoing life is not important to the animal in the way it would be to a person, your view does not and need not involve the idea that the animal is less important or has a lesser standing than the person. We might even argue that you are treating the person and the animal equally insofar as you accord to each what you suppose is important to her. This is an important part of Peter Singer's point in Animal Liberation, when he declares that, in his view, all animals, humans included, are in some sense equal. But here is another thought that is important to distinguish from the thought that moral standing comes in degrees. I mentioned cases in which we treat people differently because of differences in their natures or because of other facts about them, such as being unusually vulnerable or unable to read. Perhaps more often, however, when we treat people differently, it is because of the special relationships in which we stand to them. Most of us believe that we might owe different things to friends or family than to strangers or to our fellow citizens than to people in other countries. We sometimes describe these differences by saying, for instance, that our friends and family are more important to us than strangers are. Exactly how to understand this sort of partiality and when and why we are permitted to act on it is a highly contested question in moral philosophy. But although there is room for argument about this, most of us think that exercising this kind of partiality in certain well-defined circumstances is perfectly compatible with regarding all people as having morally equal standing. To say that someone is more important to you is not to say that he is more important or valuable absolutely. People who think their own children or their own nation or the members of their own racial or ethnic group are absolutely more important than others, not just more important to them, but more important, period, commit what most of us would probably assume as some of the most grave wrongs. Could this kind of partiality be at work in our dealings with animals? I suppose there might be circumstances in which a sense of solidarity with our own kind might reasonably enter into moral deliberation. And she points out here that the famous utilitarian philosopher, the famous anti-utilitarian philosopher Bernard Williams actually has an argument for, in her mind, human partiality in a paper called The Human Prejudice. I haven't read that, but it might be worth going and checking out. Epidemiological emergencies, or rats and mice invading our granaries, come to mind as possible examples. Suppose a certain species of animal is infecting human beings with some dangerous form of influenza, or that rats are breeding rapidly in our barns, and we decide to kill large numbers of them to defend ourselves. We might do this for the reasons I mentioned before, because we think the continuation of their lives is less important to them than the continuation of our lives is to us, and it's a case in which, regrettably, we do have to choose. But we might also do it with some sense that in situations where the issue is one of self-defense in an emergency, we may in fact legitimately prefer our own species, just as we may legitimately prefer our own families in emergencies of various kinds. Now, I am not necessarily advocating that position. I am not very confident about these particular examples. I simply mention them only to point out that if we did legitimately prefer human beings to other animals for reasons of solidarity or partiality in situations of this kind, it would not necessarily imply that we think human beings are more important than animals. it would only imply that this is one of the situations in which we think we are allowed to prefer those who are more important to us. So we should not confuse either the thought that we owe different things to animals than to people, or the thought that sometimes we may legitimately exercise a partiality to our own species, with the thought that human beings are in fact more important than animals generally. Those, in my mind, are different ideas. Section 1.3, Tethered Values. I've been trying to explain how we might arrive at the mistaken idea that human beings are more important than animals, but I have not yet said why I think that the idea is mistaken. I believe that nothing can be important without being important to someone, to some creature, to some person, or to some animal. If that is right, we need to be more specific about what exactly the claim of superior human importance is supposed to be. To whom are human beings supposed to be more important? To the universe? To God? To ourselves? Obviously, as individuals, we may be more important to ourselves than other people are, just as our families may be important to us than strangers, and in certain circumstances, the fate of human beings may be more important to us than the fate of the members of some other species. But, as I have just been suggesting, the fact that something is more important to us justifies only a limited form of partiality in certain well-defined circumstances. But the more general point is that if everything that is important must be important to someone, to some creature, then there is no place we can stand from which we can coherently ask which creatures or which kinds of creatures are more important absolutely. Things are important to creatures. The creatures themselves do not stand in some absolute rank ordering of importance. Or, rather, there is almost no place we can stand to make this sort of judgment, as I will now explain. There are two slightly different inferences you might draw from the point I just made, and it is important to distinguish between them and draw the right one. You might think what I have just said implies the view that all importance is, in a certain popular sense of the term, is relative. Then you will think that I am saying is that there are things that are important to me and things that are important to you, but there is nothing that is quite simply and absolutely important. But actually, what I have in mind is a different view, which I will call the view that all importance is tethered. In particular, it is tethered to the creature to whom the thing in question is important, and it cannot be cut loose from that creature without ceasing to be important at all. Although the view that importance is tethered denies that there is such a thing as free-floating importance, it doesn't have to imply that nothing is important absolutely. This is because it still might make perfectly good sense to say that there are things that are important to us all, to everyone for whom things can be important. In fact, if you think about it, you will see that this is what we want from a notion of absolute importance and nothing more. That it is in fact something important to anyone to whom things can be important. There's no real difference between being absolute and being relative to everyone. So there is logical space for these theses. The first thesis, which she calls the absolute importance of importance to, is it is absolutely important to us all, that every sentient creature get the good things it is important to her to get and avoid the bad things that it is important to her to avoid. Or to put the same point another way, which she calls the absolute goodness of goodness for, which is, it is absolutely good for us all, that every sentient creature get the things that are good for her and avoid the things that are bad for her. And I'll just clarify here that, because I'm reading the language here and I see how it might be interpreted this way. She's not arguing here for like an altruism versus egoism thing. She's just saying that it's categorically the case, or the case in all things that can have a notion of good, or things that, can care about whether or not something is the case, or, have an opinion about things, that the state of the world is in accordance with those opinions. It's not like she's not saying that it's good for me that in fact someone else has stuff done for them that they want. She's just saying that it is possible for all things that do value to have those things in accord, and in fact that there can be things that all things that can value all things that can value do value, which will be a little bit more elucidated later on. I'll just say here that this is where Kant begins to enter this book, and although she's not making it explicit, if you've been around like the AY server and stuff, this is where she's starting to talk about notions of categorical imperatives or categorical reasons. So she's using the word absolutely here, and notions of for us all, etc. That would be synonymous in effect with the notions of like categorical imperatives or whatnot that are mentioned frequently in debate servers on here. Anyways, I'll continue on. Of course, there is a complication that arises from the view that all value is tethered, about how we could establish these theses that I have mentioned. We cannot move away from the claim, or we cannot move from the claim that something is good for you to the claim that it is good absolutely, simply by invoking the premise that it is good absolutely in an untethered way, that all sentient creatures should get what is good for them. Instead, we have to arrive at the conclusion that what is good for you is good absolutely by showing that it is, in a certain way, good for everyone. Or, from everyone's point of view, that all sentient creatures get what is good for them. We'll be coming back later to the question whether and how that could be true in chapters 8 and then later in 12. But this is the problem I mentioned at the end of 1.3.2. The logical opening for the absolute goodness of goodness for theses, and also leaves a logical opening for the view that human welfare is more important absolutely than that of the other animals. It is just that what we would have to show is that even from the point of view of the other animals, what is good for human beings matters more than what is good for those other animals themselves. We would have to show that human good is what is best for them, or show that from their point of view, that the human good is the best. It is hard to imagine anything that could make that even remotely plausible, except for some sort of teleological view. And I recognize that word is a little bit inside baseball. So teleology is just to say that there's like an objective function to something. So like we might say that the telos or the teleology of a shovel is to dig holes. And so she's saying that like to show the kind of thing that she's asking for here, you'd have to like, almost invoke almost in sort of like a theological or whatever way that things like animals and plants and whatnot are designed for humans. And so what is good for an animal or what is good for a plant or whatever is to be good for a human. And so she's, at least for the moment, like setting that aside. So according to which human good is the purpose of the world towards which all things in some way strive. And of course, that is no accident. The view that human beings are more important than the other animals wears its religious heritage on its sleeve. However, does it make any difference if there is a deity and human beings are more important to that deity than the other animals are? In general, the fact that I am more important to some third party, say, for example, my mother, than other people does not make my value any more absolute. Whatever value that gives me is still tethered to her point of view, which may not be shared by others. This is part of the problem with the teleological argument I have just gestured at. If we suppose that argument to be supported by religious considerations, even if a deity created the animals for our use, or to play some other auxiliary role in a drama of which human beings are the protagonists, there is nothing, absent further argument, to say that this fact should be important from the point of view of the animals themselves. If there were an evil demon instead of a god who created human beings to serve as food for crocodiles, that would not make being eaten by a crocodile a good thing for you or from your point of view. So in the absence of some further argument, I cannot begin to see why it would make a difference. If value is tethered to the point of view of someone who can value things, being valued by a deity could only give us a tethered value. She says in an aside here, when I first advanced these ideas in the form of the David Ross Boyd lectures in 2007, Linda Zagzebski asked me if I thought it would make any difference if human beings were more important to God than the other animals are. This discussion is prompted by that question. But of course, the ultimate conclusion I would draw from the discussions in this book is that it does not matter if we were created by a god for some sort of purpose, and that no morally good god would create sentient beings just to be means to someone else's ends. And then she also points out that in The Human Prejudice by Bernard Williams, he ascribes to the Renaissance humanists the view that if man's fate is a very special concern to God, there is nothing more absolute than that. It is a central concern, period. And so she's clearly trying to point out how much she disagrees with Williams here. But going on, of course, those who hold that human beings are more important absolutely can deny that they hold the implausible view that human beings and the human good are more important than the other animals, even from the point of view of the animals themselves. They can do this by denying the importance that importance and goodness are in fact tethered. Then they can suppose that human beings can be more important than the other animals without being more important to anyone in particular. The belief in untethered importance puts humans in a position to imagine that we can make claims about our own superior value that do not in fact make any sense, except outside of what I consider an antiquated teleological conception of the world. Section 1.4, Why Tethered Values and Superior Importance are Almost Incompatible. There is another way in which we might be tempted to think that the superior importance of human beings is compatible with a tethered conception of importance and value. J.M. Coetzee, in The Lives of Animals, conjures up, without endorsement, an imaginary philosopher, Thomas O'Hearn, who says, "It is okay to kill animals, because their lives are not as important to them as ours are to us." One difficulty with this remark is that it is ambiguous, in a way that talk of the value of life tends to be a bit ambiguous. When we talk about someone's life, we may simply mean their duration through time, or we may mean something like the totality of their endeavors and experiences. If O'Hearn is using life in the first sense to mean one's duration throughout time, he is voicing a view that I mentioned earlier, the view that it is only the immediate or local quality of life and not its duration or the continuing of life that matters to the other animals, so that it does not matter if we kill them so long as we do it humanely. But if he means something like the totality of one's endeavors and experiences, then O'Hearn is saying something much more radical, that things in general just matter more to people than they do to the other animals. Perhaps he thinks that there is some metric along which we can compare how important everything is to you to how important everything is in another animal's life to her. Then, if your life is more important to you, measured by that metric, in his mind it somehow follows that it is more important absolutely. More important in some way that makes everything that happens to you more important, so that the other animal's interests may always be sacrificed to yours. Does that idea make any sense? First, ask yourself by what metric we might measure how important your life is to you, and compare it to how important some other animal's life is to her. Would you be willing to chew off your leg to save yourself if you got caught in a trap? How much pain are you prepared to endure in order to go on living? How likely are you to commit suicide because you are sick of yourself and your life? How likely is your dog to do that? Or, pressing in the other direction, what sorts of things are you prepared to die for because they are more important to you than your own life? For human beings, especially good human beings, we think that many things, such as justice and the welfare of others, and perhaps the continuing existence of our kind, can be worth dying for, while for the other animals, their own lives and perhaps those of their offspring are pretty much all that there is. Now, you may want to protest that this last thought suggests that I am missing the point O'Hearn is making, for you may wish to say that the fact that we human beings value many things in life more than our own pleasant experiences while the other animals do not is exactly what shows that there is a sense in which everything is more important to us than it is to the other animals. We treasure ourselves as a species more, we value ourselves more, we have more meaning in our own eyes than the other animals do. The other animals just have a pleasant time or not, while for us human beings, existence is fraught with meaning and value. One response to this would be to point out that our tendency to think this may just be another instance of the egocentric predicament. That is, of our inability to empathize sufficiently with others, and to grasp that the subjectivity of others is just as real as our own. In Middlemarch, George Eliot tells the story of Dorothea, an idealistic young woman hungry to do some good in the world, who marries Mr. Casaubon, an older man whom she conceives to be a scholar engaged in a great work. Describing a moment when Dorothea has seriously misunderstood Casaubon's feelings, Eliot writes, "We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom than to conceive with the distinctedness which is no longer reflection but feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent center of self, whence the lights and shadows must always fall with a certain difference." Eliot describes the moment when Dorothea realizes this as one of moral revelation, a moment in which Dorothea finally grasps the fact that there is as great a need on his side as on her own, and that in this way she acquires a new motive. Eliot here reminds us how hard it is to keep in our view, not just to tell yourself, but to feel with the directedness of sense, that even other people's lives are just as important, just as real, and just as vivid, just as fraught with meaning and value to them as yours is to you. It is the perpetual temptation, especially of the safe and of the privileged, to harbor the thought that those less fortunate than ourselves are just simpler beings to whom misfortune probably just doesn't matter much anyway, or at least in the same vivid way as if it were happening to us. It is particularly easy to harbor such thoughts if the unfortunate ones are illiterate or inarticulate or unsophisticated, and if they're in some other way alien, like being of another race. It is easy to assume, without realizing you are assuming it, that having to work 14-hour days, or losing yet another child to malaria, or even dying young, cannot really matter to the kind of people to whom these things routinely happen. Quite as much as it would matter to you if you were in their place. It is therefore all too easy to be insufficiently struck with the hardness or tragedy of their experience. How much harder, then, must it be for us to wrap our minds around the ways in which creatures of a different species, whose minds are in some ways deeply alien to our own, might experience their own fates and their own existence, and how important they might be to themselves from the point of view of what Eliot calls their own centers of self. For all that, I think that there is something right about the claim that we human beings matter to ourselves and value ourselves in a way that is different from the way the other animals do, as I will explain later. But this does not have the implication that what happens to us matters more than what happens to our fellow creatures. In fact, if importance and value are tethered, then even if it did make sense to say that we matter more to ourselves than to the other animals do to themselves, this would not mean that we mattered more absolutely. The fact that we might matter more to ourselves need not be important to the other animals at all. I have claimed that everything that is important must be important to someone, that goodness is tethered to the creatures for whom it is good. In this chapter, I have discussed the implications of that claim, but I have not yet explained why I think it is true. In chapter 2, I will present an account of the good from which it follows that value is tethered. But before I go on, I want to make sure that my message is clear. I have not exactly been arguing that animals are just as important as people. You'll remember that earlier I endorsed Peter Singer's claim that you can treat people and animals differently without treating them unequally. The remark I just made may seem incompatible with that. In chapter 4, I explain what I think is a little off about the idea that all creatures are equally important. But I have, in my mind, been arguing that the comparison that is made against the animals is nearly incoherent. If everything that is important to someone, to some person, or to some animal, there is no place to stand and make a comparative judgment, or at least one with any plausibility, about the comparative importance of people and animals themselves. All right. Let's see. That was chapter 1. I'm happy to keep going. It's been like an hour. I don't know how people are feeling. I don't know if you guys want to do like a vote in chat or something quickly. I'm just going to quickly drink some water because my throat's really dry. And I'll let you guys sort of like vote in chat if you want me to continue on to chapter 2, where she begins to sort of justify the notion of the good that she was just talking about, the tethered one, and begins to flesh out the metaphysics in her mind of what animal selfhood is like. Okay, so it looks like it's like 7-1. So I think what I'll do is we'll do chapter 2, and that means that we'll have done. I think that's so yeah, chapter 2. That'll be half of part 1, and then I think Beyond and I will put a poll into book discussion about what day and what time people want me to do the other half of part 1. So yeah, we'll finish this part. So just give me 1 second. I'm gonna go grab some water quickly, and then I'll continue. Okay, so if everyone's ready, I'm gonna start going again. I don't know if I want to do. If anyone has like any like questions or anything about chapter 1, maybe we should go over them quickly. It got got a little bit dense near the end there. I don't know if I hope everyone was following. I'll point out that very frequently with like philosophical texts, you generally speaking want to review them. It's like very abstract stuff, and although this is a little bit more applied, it's easy sometimes to think that you're understanding what she's saying, and then not really actually get it. So I think it's worth going back and reviewing some of this stuff in that PDF that's linked in the info channel. And then furthermore, I'm always happy to answer questions or even do like more private reading sessions if people want to go over these chapters again. But the basic overview of that chapter, sort of like Beyond was just pointing out, is that in her mind, many of the ways in which not just non-vegans but vegans as well consider animals is fraught with something that she thinks is incoherent, which is the idea that there is a way in which humans matter more in an absolute sense, or in a way that is like above and beyond individuals are the kind of thing that can value. And so even though it's very popular on here to posit something like a sentience hierarchy and to say that that confers cases where something matters more, there, in her mind, all that we're expressing there is that it just matters more to humans, and that we're not saying something of like an absolute moral variety there. We're just saying like some kind of like sentimental thing there. If we really try to consider absolute morality, in her mind, what we have to do is really consider something that has to be true of everyone. And so she'll explain that more in this chapter, but the basic idea is like just consider like a counter possible, or like the contrary, where instead of, human beings being this thing that has like more of a consideration or more consciousness or whatever that is supposed to mean or whatever that's supposed to look like. Like, what if it was the case that the human beings were the ones that were more good, or the ones that were better to be killed or eaten or whatever? We wouldn't like that, or wouldn't be good for us. And so it has to be important that we don't leave those considerations aside. And in fact, as she points out, that a lot of kinds of prejudices and moral quandaries are in fact born out of our decision, whether explicit or implicit, to sort of forget that other things do actually have things that they care about, and that those things do actually matter to them in a way that is perhaps even incomparable with the ways in which things matter to us. Like, there's no way to put them above the other. Even if you consider things like sentience hierarchies and whatnot, they're just sort of a different category, is all that she's trying to say. But because I haven't really seen her... Okay, well, so what is she saying? If animal lives matter less to them as ours matter to us, does that justify killing them if true? How can we determine that? So the big thing is that later on, she does get into the practical applications of this theory. And I've cited, for example, I think that her expression of what this like view would do to animal testing is like one of the best ones of the few that she provides, and it points out that there's not really a coherent way to say like there's an absolute sense in which we should be like testing on animals, or an absolute sense in which we should be killing things. It can only be the case that we're saying it in this sort of like very much like greedy way that doesn't care about the other animals. And that having a notion of good where it's like good for the animals to be killed is one that just like completely forgets about the animals themselves. But anyways, I'm going to continue on. So yeah, chapter 2, animal selves and the good. And so from the Nicomachean Ethics, presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function, so would it seem to be for the man, if he has a function. So 2.1, the origin of the good. In chapter 1, I argued that people are not just more important than animals, not exactly because animals are just as important as people, but because the comparison does not make much sense at all. People and animals are the beings to whom things are important, and all importance must remain tethered to them. Everything that is important to someone. To put it another way, everything that is good or bad must be good or bad for someone. We may, of course, be important to ourselves, and our own existence, among other things, may in fact be a great good for us. But the other animals may also be important to themselves in their way, and their own existence may also be a great good for them. In fact, I am about to argue that this is so. Conscious existence is in itself a good for people and animals alike. Let's start with a fundamental question. Why is anything important or valuable at all? Why is there such a thing as value? In arguing that the importance of something is always tethered to some creature, I have already given you a clue to what I think the answer is. I think that there are things that matter because there are entities to whom those things matter. Entities for whom things can be good or bad in the sense that matters morally. What are these entities, though? The answer, I am about to argue, is basically animals and creatures, including ourselves. This remark, as I will demonstrate, is in fact true by definition. For there is a very tight connection between the concept of an animal, at least on one philosophical conception of what an animal is, and the concept of a being for whom things can be good or bad. A being who, as I like to put it, has a good. I said a moment ago that animals, almost by definition, have a good in the sense that might matter morally. This qualification is necessary because we use the word good in two different ways, each associated with its own sense of good for. First, good in our more general term of positive evaluation, a term we apply to nearly every kind of thing, or at least every kind of thing for which we have any use or with which we interact. Think of the wide variety of things we evaluate as good or bad. Cars, houses, machines and instruments, dogs and cats, food, the weather, days, prose, pictures, movies. People consider as occupying roles or having jobs such as mother, teacher, son, president, friend, carpenter, and people considered just as people among many other things. All of these things may, in my mind, be evaluated as either good or bad. I am going to call that sense of the good evaluative, or, for reasons I will explain later, the functional sense. I call good, in the second sense, in which we use the term the final sense of good, borrowing one familiar translation of the Greek word telos, meaning a goal or an end. We call something good in the final sense when we consider it worth having, realizing, or bringing about simply for its own sake. We suppose that something we call the good, or in our own case, the human good, is the end or aim of all of our strivings, or at any rate, the crown of their success. The summum bonum, a state of affairs that is desirable or valuable or worth achieving simply for its own sake. Final goods are the ends of action, and the conditions that result from the successful pursuit of those ends. Ask yourself, why do we use the same word, good, both as our most general term of positive evaluation and to designate the ends of action and the conditions that result from their successful pursuit? What do the two uses have in common? I think most people think that the answer to this question is obvious, that in both cases we are simply using the term evaluatively. That is, they think that when we use the word good to refer to a final good, that it is just a special case of the evaluative good, one in which we are evaluating is a person's ends or that person's life as a whole. Now this seems reasonable, but there is a puzzle about how exactly we are supposed to go about evaluating lives as a whole and ends. As Plato and Aristotle pointed out long ago, evaluation is usually related to the purpose, the role, or the function of the entity that is judged good or bad. An entity is good in the evaluative sense when it has the properties that enable it to serve its function, either its usual or natural function, or one we have assigned to it for some specific purpose. A good knife is sharp because the function of knives is cutting. A good teacher is clear because the function of a teacher is to help her students to understand the material. A good car handles easily, it gets good gas mileage, and it goes fast because the function of a car is to get people quickly and safely to destinations that they cannot easily reach on foot. These things are evaluated as good because they have the properties that enable them to perform their functions well. But what is the function of an end or of a life? Ends and lives do not have functions. In fact, to say something is an end and not a means is precisely to say that we do not value it merely because of some other purpose that it serves. But then, how are we evaluating it when we say that it is good? To what evaluative standard are we appealing? One thing that seems clear is that when we say that a life is good, in the sense that we now want, the sense that allows us to say that it is good for the creature or important to the creature whose life it is, we are looking for a standard that makes it good from the point of view of the creature. A life could be good from some other point of view, like that of the farmer who values his cow, but that does not give us the sense that supports the idea that the life is good for the cow. This point turns out to be the key to solving our problem. I mean, the problem of how we evaluate ends and lives, although it will take me a little while to explain why. First, notice that evaluative or functional sense of good, the sense in which a good knife is sharp and a good car handles well, also supports the notion of good for, in a very particular way. If a thing is good when it has the properties that enable it to perform its function well, then the conditions and actions that tend to give rise to those properties or enable the thing to maintain them count as good for it. In this sense, which I am going to call the functional sense of good for, it might be good for your knife to get sharpened regularly, and bad for your knife to be used on a material that tends to dull its blade. A whetstone, therefore, is good for your knife. A certain kind of gasoline might be good for your car, and it might be bad for your car to leave it sitting idle too long. When we use the concept of good for in this way, we refer to activities or conditions that maintain or promote the ability of the knife or the car to function well. But of course, we do not mean that they are good from the point of view of the knife or the car, for as far as I'm concerned, knives and cars do not have points of view. Now, think about what an animal is. Aristotle taught us that it is possible to regard living organisms as having a function, which he identified as that of maintaining their own forms. Aristotle argued that everything, every substance, whatever, can be seen as having both a form and a matter. The matter is the material or parts of which it is composed, and the form is the way the parts are put together, which is what makes it the kind of thing that it is. In particular, the form is what enables the thing to serve its function. So for instance, we might say that the matter of a house is a roof, walls, windows, and doors. Then we impose some form on these parts by establishing certain relations between them. We line the walls up corner to corner, we put the roof over the top, we insert the door into one of the walls so that we can go in and out, and behold, we have an object that can function as a shelter, something in which people can keep themselves and their things safe from other people and the weather. Aristotle was also impressed by the fact that living organisms are made of fragile materials that are constantly being used as energy or worn out or damaged in other ways. But organisms constantly take in new materials from the environment through the nutritive process and turn those materials into fresh parts of themselves, thus keeping themselves, for a while at least, in existence. Furthermore, living organisms also make new things like themselves, things with the same form as themselves, through reproduction. So, Aristotle observed that we can explain a great deal about living organisms if we view them as objects that have the function of maintaining their own forms. In these two senses, first, they maintain themselves in existence as individual members of their kind, and second, they maintain their species by producing new members of their kind. When we view an organism as a functional object in this way, then it is like any other functional object. We can see the things and conditions that enable it to perform its function, to stay alive and reproduce, as things that are good for it, in this functional sense of good for. Just as the whetstone is good for the knife, and being driven now and then is good for the car, rain and sunshine are good for the plants, and fresh air and exercise are good for both you and your dog. There are two important differences between animals and functional objects like knives and cars, however. The first difference applies to organisms generally. Although we are getting better at producing machines that are in various ways self-maintaining, generally speaking, a knife does not sharpen itself, and a car does not seek out the best quality of gasoline. But a living organism does do things like that. So there is something special about the way that organisms function, which is by tending to their own well-functioning, by looking after it. In fact, unlike a car or a knife that is an organism's function to maintain its own well-functioning or its own and that of its species. After all, that is really all that organisms do. They look after themselves and their offspring, and so keep themselves and their kind in being. There is a kind of self-referential character to an organism's function, for her function is more or less to continue functioning in the way that is characteristic of her kind and nothing more. Or at least, we can see organisms this way, a point I will come back to later in this chapter. And when we do see them this way, we see them as beings for whom things can be good or bad in the functional sense of good for and bad for. That is what we were doing when we say that the rain and the sunshine are good for the plants. We mean that the rain and the sunshine are helping the plants to maintain those properties that enable the plants to perform their function, which is simply to stay alive and reproduce. So the first difference is that living organisms take care of themselves. The second difference brings us to what is distinctive about animals as opposed to plants. An animal, at least as I will use the term here, is a particular kind of living organism. An animal is an organism that functions, at least in part, by representing her environment to herself through her senses, and then by acting in light of those representations. She is guided by her representations to get the things that are good for her and to avoid the things that are bad for her, in the functional senses of good for and bad for. In order for an animal's representational system to do its work in this way, however, it has to have what I will call a valenced character. That means that the things she encounters in her environment have to strike her as attractive or aversive, welcome or unwelcome, pleasant or painful, and in particular ways, depending on whether or how they are good or bad for her. She has to be drawn by the way things appear to her and seek out the things that are good for her and to avoid the things that are bad. So she has to perceive the world evaluatively as a place full of things which present themselves as attractive and to be sought, and things which present themselves as aversive and to be avoided. And she notes here that some readers may think that I have overstated matters when I say that animals' representations have to have a valenced character. Couldn't they just serve as stimuli to which the animal responds in a mechanical way without feeling much of much of anything. After all, there are machines that respond to environmental stimuli, sometimes in fairly complex ways. For example, self-driving cars. The tropic responses of plants serve as another example. I am not totally sure what to say about that, so I am just going to say that if an organism's representations were not valenced, that organism would not have a final good. Instead, I'm interested here in the kinds of creatures which we know have a valenced representation through our various sciences. To show this, I will explain the role of pleasure and pain and evaluate it versus the research in Chapter 9. Further going on, she says, in other words, an animal experiences her own conditions and the things that affect them as good and bad for her. But now they are not merely good or bad in the functional sense, but in the final sense too. Since getting the things that are good for her and avoiding the things that are bad for her have become the ends of action, because this is how an animal works. That is how she functions and how she goes about tending to her own well-functioning. She is designed to monitor her own condition, that is, her own ability to function, by representing the world in ways that will motivate her to keep her condition good. A well-functioning animal likes to eat when she is hungry, is eager to mate, feeds and cares for her offspring, works assiduously to keep herself clean and healthy, fears her enemies, and avoids sources of injury. Now don't say, well, of course she does. Allow yourself for a moment to be struck by the fact that there are entities, substances, things that stand in this relation to themselves and their condition. Because what I am saying is that an animal functions in part by making her own well-functioning, the things that are good for her in the functional sense, an end of action, a thing to go for, a final good. The final good came into the world with animals. For an animal is pretty much by definition the kind of thing that has a final good. A good in the sense that might matter morally. Now I will draw one of the conclusions that I had promised you earlier. It is almost a necessary truth that for an animal who functions by taking her own well-functioning as an end, her life itself as a good for her, her very existence is a good for her, so long as she is well-functioning and in good enough condition to keep herself that way. The reason is simple. To be well-functioning is the good, but to be well-functioning is also simply to be alive and in reasonably good health in the manner characteristic for your kind. So life itself is a good for almost any animal who is in reasonably good shape. That is why when you feel especially you good, you might say, I really feel alive. You feel your life, and you feel it as a good to you, as it is the nature of any animal to do. Now I say almost because it seems possible that there are some simple animals for whom the primary conscious experiences are pains and aversions to the sources of bad functioning, rather than enjoyment of the sources of good functioning. Such simple animals might simply relapse into a sort of neutral state whenever their needs were satisfied, and they were safe from threats, from predators or external conditions that might cause them injury, supposing that ever happens. For such an animal, the final good would not amount to much more than avoiding the bad. But the animals that I am concerned with, and in fact see all animals as, are not like that. For most, or not all animals, eating and drinking, sexual activity, physical activity, playing with their children and with each other, warmth and comfort and companionship are all positive goods. It is a mistake to think that life it is a mistake to think of life as simply a big empty space into which good or bad things may equally well be inserted. Life is a good. Existence is a good, except when it is bad. And that is not a tautology. So now, let me come back to the question I raised earlier in the chapter. By what standard are we evaluating a creature's life or her ends or her condition when we say that they are good in the final sense of good? When we say that something is a final good, what we are saying is that it constitutes or contributes to the well-functioning of an entity who experiences her own functional condition in a valenced way, and thereby pursues her own functional goods through action. Now, some readers may have doubts about whether this standard applies to the human good. The standard essentially is saying that the final good for an animal is to lead a healthy life of her kind in reasonably good conditions, and that they might think that this seems too thin to pick out for the human good. I think that this standard does pick out the human good correctly, but we must remember that what counts as well-functioning for a creature whose self-maintenance includes the maintenance of what I call a practical identity in a complex matter. For the notion of practical identity, I will explain what I mean in Chapter 3. I also develop the notion elsewhere in the sources of normativity and in self-constitution, agency, identity, and integrity. Okay, moving on. The standard, in my mind, is one deployed from necessarily the standpoint of empathy. Because when we invoke it, we are looking at the creature's functional goods as they appear in her own view in the way that she necessarily looks at them herself, as things worth pursuing or realizing for their own sake. Final goods exist because there are such creatures for whom things can be good or bad. Now, by empathy, I mean the ability I discussed in Chapter 1. The ability to look at things through the eyes of another and to appreciate the significance from their point of view. Empathy, as I understand it, does not necessarily result in compassion, although it has a tendency to do so. Some people associate empathy with our emotional rather than rational nature, but I think that this is a mistake, and that it, in fact, involves both. In fact, although empathy comes in degrees for reasons I will discuss in Chapter 3, it can only be achieved in the higher degrees by rational creatures who are able to detach from their own perspective. However, let's now consider some objections to the account I have just given. A small one, a medium-sized one, and then finally, a big one. The small one is that the definition that I have given of what an animal is not the same definition a contemporary biologist would give. A quote-unquote animal, as I am using the term, is an organism that functions as an agent, where by agency I mean something like representation-governed locomotion. Animals are conscious organisms who seek out the things that are functionally good for them and try to avoid the things are bad. Some readers will wonder what relationship I am positing between the animal's intentional states and the animal's functional good. Plainly, some animals might not think about what is good for them, including humans. I discuss further in Chapter 3 the relationship between the purposes of an animal's thoughts and the animal's good. But moving along, comparatively, modern science also distinguishes groups or kingdoms in the biological world other than animals and plants, Fungi and bacteria form separate kingdoms, and these kingdoms are distinguished not just by whether they are conscious agents, but by their modes of nutrition. Animals consume other organisms, plants can make energy from sunlight or methane. We look at the features of their cell structure and things of that sort of kind. Some things count as animals that do not, or anyway do not obviously, fit my account of what an animal is. So, for example, a sea sponge. I do not think that this matters to the topic. The organisms we are concerned with when we think about whether we have duties to animals are sentient beings who perceive the world in valenced ways and act accordingly. This is the feature of organic life that I have argued places an organism in the morally interesting category of having a final good. If plants and sea sponges are not agents in this sense, then they do not have final goods, although, in a sense, they will have functional goods. And if, as I will argue later, having a final good is the ground of moral standing, then it follows that we do not explicitly have duties to plants and to sponges. Now, the medium-sized objection concerns what I have just said now. Why should we think only animals, in my sense of quote-unquote animals, have a final good? Why not plants and objects, especially things like tools and machines? I have claimed that knives and cars have a functional good, when certain properties or conditions help to promote or maintain their well-functioning. Then we say that those properties and conditions are good for them. Being sharpened is good for a knife. High-quality gasoline is good for the car. Then why shouldn't we say that a sharp knife that is cutting or a car that is humming along smoothly down the highway has achieved its final good? My view is that knives and cars are not guided by conscious, valenced experiences, of course, but why exactly is that so important to having a final good? Unfortunately, I will not be able to give a complete answer to this question until later on in Chapter 9. But in the meantime, I should mention that there is another reason why objects do not have a final good. Intuitively, we do not think that a sharp blade benefits the knife. Rather, it benefits the person who is going to use the knife to do some cutting. This creates a problem for thinking about what is good for objects. The problem is that when we think about what is good for an object, in the functional sense of good for, it is fundamentally unclear whether we are really thinking about what's something that enables the object to perform its function, or something that would give it other properties that we as agents would like for it to have. This is because it is fundamentally unclear whether we should count as part of its function it's having all of the properties that we as agents might like it having. A common example of what I have in mind is when we say that something is good for an object, meaning that it will enable the artifact to keep functioning and last for a long time. I'll explore this notion more in Chapter 11. Is the function of a knife just to cut, or also to stay in good cutting condition for as long as possible? We prefer objects that last for a long time, and that makes us think of objects rather as if they were organisms, for it is part of the function of a living thing to last, that is, to keep itself alive. But self-maintenance is not, or at least not obviously, part of the function of an object, or rather, it only is if we say so. Objects exist for our benefit, and so do not have a final good of their own. But this does not mean that there could not be an object with a final good. Animals are material objects, and more material objects can be made. If we invented a machine that was conscious and had valenced experiences, that guided her to pursue her own functional good, then she would be an animal under my definition, and she would therefore have a final good. But then, don't plants have a final good? Many people, especially those who are sympathetic to the Aristotelian ideas to which I am appealing here, think that plants have a final good. And it is easy to see why, because I think we are not much inclined to accept the kind of story I just told about objects when we were talking about plants. Plants seem to have a good of their own. They do not exist for our benefit. After all, sunshine and rain are good for the weeds as well as for the flowers and the beans and the berries that we hope will grow in our gardens. And that does not seem to be because what is good for the weeds is in some way good for us. It seems like it would be true that sunshine and rain would be good for the plants even if we, and in fact every other animal, ceased to exist. The good of plants is final in a slightly different sense of final than the one I have been discussing here. I have been talking about final in the sense of an end of action. A plant's good is final in the different sense that the explanation of what is good about the sunshine and rain seems to end with the plants themselves. It does not depend the way that the good of objects does on some other good. However, there are both empirical and philosophical questions at stake in the question of whether plants have a final good in my sense, which of course I will not settle here. The tropic responses of plants, flowers turning towards the sun, roots growing towards moister soil, these do involve mechanisms that are in some ways like perception, and in some ways like action, and they do serve the plant's functional good. So there are questions about whether those similarities are sufficient to make plants count as agents who pursue their final good. Among other things, these include questions about whether a plant's form of responsiveness is something fundamentally different from locomotion guided by representation, or something that is on the low end of a scale or gradient whose high end is being a conscious agent. That is partly a philosophical question about the nature of what might be considered consciousness itself, and one I cannot attempt to answer here. She notes that Daniel Shimovich, in What a Plant Knows, a field guide to the senses, makes the case that plants have a genuine form of sentience. It is not merely that they respond to light, smell, and touch, but that some of the genetic bases for their doing so is the same as in animals. Another recent book exploring related questions is Brilliant Green, The Surprising History and Science of Plant Intelligence by Stefano Mancuso and Alessandra Viola. The latter book, however, makes, in my mind, a rather free use of mere analogies between plant and animal functioning. So therefore, for the time being, I will leave the notion of plant sentience and whether or not plants have my notion of the final good aside. Now, for the big objection. I have followed Aristotle and a long tradition in talking about organisms and their parts as having functions. In particular, about organisms having the function of self-maintenance. People often say that we no longer believe in natural purposes or natural functions. Instead, we believe that organisms evolved through natural selection. In Chapter 1, I castigated my opponents for secretly adhering to the implications of an antiquated teleological conception of the world. But you will object, this is all that I am doing myself. I might respond that the theory of evolution does not show us that there are no functionally self-maintaining objects. Instead, it shows us how there can be such objects even if No one designed them. We might then also be tempted to say that it also explains something else about organisms. If we regard living organisms as self-maintaining systems, we must regard them as extremely defective ones, for all individuals, it seems, eventually die. If individuals are essentially self-maintaining, why should that be? What is biologically necessary for the species, or for the genes, if you like, is only that there are individuals who live long enough to reproduce, and so maintain themselves long enough to reproduce. So, you might say, animals are defective, self-maintaining systems because natural selection only selects for self-maintenance up to the time of reproduction. But this response, of course, only brings out a deeper problem. Why call the individual organisms self-maintaining at all? Why isn't it only, or at most, the species that may be regarded as self-maintaining? In fact, for individuals, there is a further problem, which is even trickier to deal with. Consider, even if an organism were successfully self-maintaining, it could still die of an accident. It could get eaten, or burnt up in a fire, or squashed by a meteorite, or trapped in a deep pit where its needs could not be met. Now, I should admit that the distinction between dying from a failure of self-maintenance and dying from an accident is a little wobbly. Aristotle thought of self-maintenance primarily as manifested in nutrition and reproduction. But we might also think of it as manifested in the body's ability to cure itself of small injuries and build up resistance to illnesses. Then, however, we are faced with a puzzle. Why should the body's ability to heal a scrape on the knee be a manifestation of self-maintenance, but its inability to heal itself from being smashed by a meteorite not be a failure of self-maintenance? In a sense, these two kinds of injuries are continuous with each other. I'm not totally sure what to say about this yet. These are, perhaps, just the hazards of material existence. There are a few species of organisms, and the examples might be controversial, but let's say hydras, flatworms, a certain species of jellyfish has been suggested, that apparently do always die of accidents, and so are potentially, though never actually, immortal. Now, we might say this about the extinction of species too, that though it always happens, it is always because of the external forces like climate change, the evolution of rival species, contagious illnesses, and so on. But most animals and most species are doomed to die of senescence, the natural weakening of the body or the kind with age, even if they do not die of an accident or a disease. Perhaps this is better for the species, since an ever-fresh supply of slightly different individuals enables it to adapt better to changing conditions, so that its members do not all die of accidents. But if that is true, how can the individuals of the species be characterized as self-maintaining? For these animals, death is not just a hazard of material existence, it is, in Aristotelian terms, built into the form. This raises some large issues about the use of the notion of function in biology. For if nothing is really biologically self-maintaining, then it is not clear what entitles us to use the concept of function when we talk about living things. But if we cannot talk about function when we talk about organisms, then we cannot talk about the functional good either. And if they have no function, they have no functional good, then really nothing is functionally good for them. In that case, we are saying something without foundation when we say that sunshine and rain are good for the plants in the functional sense of good for. Or at most, if we grant that the species is self-maintaining, it is all just a shorthand way of saying that it is good for the species. If we cannot talk about an individual's functional good, then I cannot say that final good and the final sense of good for appeared in the world when animals evolved and began to take the things that promote their functional goods as the ends of action and to see them as things worthy of pursuit. I think we can still say these things, though. I think what all of this shows is that when we talk about functional good, we are simply saying something contextual, and that what forms the context is a point of view. Functional good is what we might call a perspective-dependent notion. Now, being perspective-dependent is not a way of being unreal or otherwise metaphysically defective. Everyone is familiar with the question whether a tree falling in the forest makes a sound if no one is listening. One possible answer to that question is no. Sounds exist in the perspective of creatures who can hear, although sound waves would still be bouncing around in the absence of such creatures. Similarly, we might say that colors exist only in the perspective of creatures with color vision. Without such creatures, there would still be light waves reflecting off of surfaces with certain frequencies, but there would not be colors. To take a somewhat different kind of case, chairs and tables exist in the perspective of creatures who need or use or conceive of furniture. Without such creatures, there might still be, say, wooden objects shaped in such and such a way, but they would not be furniture. If we were oval and swam through our atmosphere like fish, there would probably be no tables and chairs in our world. In a similar way, values exist in the perspective of a certain kind of creature, a creature who values things in the sense of having evaluative or valenced attitudes towards things. When I say that the function of a knife is cutting, that a good knife has a sharp blade, and that things that keep the knife sharp are good for the knife, I am not saying anything that has to be rejected in the name of science. I am speaking from the point of view of a human being who sometimes has to do some cutting. When I say that water is good for me since I need it to live, I say it from the point of view of a human being who wants to go on living. When I feel that water is good for me because I was dry and thirsty and the relief from that is welcome to me, I feel it from the point of view of a creature who experiences her own condition in a valenced way and who is genetically predisposed to seek out and to enjoy things such as water in order to keep myself in existence for a time. I may also be genetically predisposed to senescence, but I am not predisposed to seek it out as an end of action or to enjoy it for its own sake when it comes. Except under special circumstances, therefore, I do not regard senescence and death as part of my final good. It follows from that, or so I am about to claim, that it is not part of the functional good. Or anyways, that it not need be. A caveat here. The jury is out on whether immortality would be a good thing for people if we could have it. But that question, I think, is settled by thinking about how it relates to other things that we do experience as part of our final good. Whether it would make our lives more meaningful and interesting, our projects more worthy of pursuit, our relationships stronger or better, or whether instead it would reduce us to aimless creatures with no ends worth struggling for, bored with existence and each other. The question here is whether we have to regard death as a final good for us, not because of the way it is related to other parts of our final good, but simply because we are formed, in fact, by the fact that we die. But you will want to protest that I cannot be allowed, in the context of this argument, to limit the category of functional goods to the things that contribute to our final goods. This is because I have defined final goods in terms of functional goods. final goods are just functional goods when taken as the ends of action. So you will accuse me of reversing the order of dependence between these two forms of goodness, functional and final. I cannot claim that a final good is just functional good actively pursued, and then turn around and limit functional good to be what contributes to final good, because I would have to have an independent notion of final good before I could do so. And yet, there is another problem. Above, I suggested that death is not part of our final good because it doesn't appear good to us, and we do not seek it out as the ends of an action. But I do not want in general to identify final goods with what actually appears good to us, because I want to say we and all animals can get it wrong. It happens all the time. Animals evolve in one set of conditions, and when those conditions change, animals may want things that are not good for them, or fail to want things that are. Notoriously, for example, human beings evolved to want to stock up on salt and fat when the supplies are good, in anticipation of the lean times when they will not be. But when the lean times never come, those desires do not serve our functional good, and I want to say that their satisfaction does not serve our final good either. We are wrong not to crave a leaner, blander diet, although we have a hard time seeing it as good. If we reject the idea that the leaner, blander diet is genuinely good for us as individuals, then the only available explanation for the claim that it is better is that it serves the interest of the species. But if that is so, why aren't we wrong not to crave death, which probably seems to serve the interest of the species as well? The reason we are not wrong not to crave death is that when animals evolved to pursue their functional goods through action, something else evolved, namely consciousness, subjectivity, and then what then became essential to the individual identity of the creatures who seem to have it. When I say that something is good for me, even in the functional sense, the me that I am referring to is the embodiment of myself, a conscious object, an agent who is more or less, for, as we are about to see, this is in a matter of degree, functionally unified over time. Speaking a little roughly, yourself is functionally unified insofar as you have an integrated point of view at a time and over time that enables you to carry out your projects and stick to your commitments in a world in which you can find your way around. For a human being, this has two distinct aspects. The unity of what we may call your acting self, a unity that we may also call integrity, enables you to pursue your ends effectively and maintain your projects, commitments, relationships, and values over time. The unity of what we may call your knowing self involves the formation of an integrated conception of your environment, one that enables you to identify relations between the different parts of your environment well enough to find your way around in it. Those relations are temporal, spatial, causal, and for many animals, very social. By forming a unified concept of your environment, you also unify yourself as the subject of that conception. The fact that I identify with myself, with the agent of my projects and commitments, and the subject of my conception of the world, means that there may be things about my body, such as its tendency to die, that are not in fact good for me, even if perhaps they are good for my species or my genes. They are not good, that is, for the thing that I experience and identify as me. My functional good is what maintains the aspects of me that support my having a self. So, in my mind, I have not reversed the order between final good and functional good. Instead, what I have done is point out something that happens to the identity of an object when that object acquires consciousness and a point of view, the object acquires a new form of identity, a self. And since it is the self that experiences its condition and the things in the world as good or bad, and the self that decides what to do and how it acts, it is the self that in fact has a final good. Now, some people think that you have to be self-conscious in order to have a self. The self is not like most other things which exist independently of your awareness of them. Your self only exists, they claim, if you have some awareness that it is there. And that, of course, would have to be a kind of self-awareness. Initially, it may seem paradoxical that you could be aware of something that would not exist at all unless you were aware of it. But if you think about it, you will see why it is plausible that the self should have this reflexive character. After all, as I have already suggested, you acquire a self when you acquire a point of view, a form of awareness. After all, as I have already suggested, you acquire a self when you acquire a point of view, a form of awareness. Having a point of view introduces a distinction between yourself and the rest of the world. It identifies you and makes you identify yourself with a specific spot in the world from which the rest of the world appears to you. It identifies some of the things that happen in the world as things that happen to you. It does this not just externally, but from your point of view. So to have a self is to have a point of view. And to have a point of view is to be aware of the difference between you and everything else. And in that sense, to be aware of yourself. What I have just been saying about the connection between having a self and having a final good seems to require that thought. Since I claimed that having a self determines what you identify as yourself. It causes you to identify with the features of your embodiment that support the existence of a unified point of view, and to regard only those features as part of your functional good. But if the self is dependent on self-consciousness in this way, can the other animals have selves? It is sometimes said that human beings are the only animals who are self-conscious. Immanuel Kant once wrote, "The fact that man can have the idea I raises him infinitely above all the other beings living on earth. By this he is a person, and by virtue of the unity of his consciousness, through all the changes he may undergo, he is one and the same person. That is, a being altogether different in rank and dignity from things, such as irrational animals, which we can dispose of as we please." Kant thinks that only we human beings think about ourselves. We do not know much about the thoughts of animals or about what goes on when they are thinking. The serious study of animal minds is a very young science, less than a century old. Presumably, it is different for different animals depending on what sort of cognitive powers they might have. It may be true that only we human beings think about ourselves, if that means having thoughts in which we identify ourselves as I. But even if it were, the issue is more complicated than that. For self-consciousness is something that comes in degrees and takes many different forms. One form of self-consciousness is revealed by the famous mirror test used in animal studies. In the mirror test, a scientist paints, say, a red spot on an animal's body and then puts her in front of a mirror. If the animal eventually reaches for the spot and tries to rub it off, or looks away from the mirror towards that location on her body, we seem to think that we can take that as evidence that the animal recognizes herself in the mirror, and it is curious about what happened to her body. To date, apes, dolphins, elephants, and some birds have passed the mirror test. An animal that passes the mirror test seems to know that a certain body is her own or herself. She recognizes the animal in the mirror as me, and therefore some people think must have a conception of me. But failure to pass the mirror test does not imply that an animal is not self-conscious. For one thing, many animals are not visually oriented. Imagine you are confronted with a surface which reflects back your distinctive odor. If you failed to identify that smell as me, would that show that you are not self-conscious? More generally, I think it can be argued that even animals who do not pass the mirror test have forms of self-consciousness. In fact, I think it can be argued that pleasure and pain are necessarily forms of self-consciousness, since what the animal who experiences these things is experiencing is the effects of the world on themselves, on their own condition. In that sense, it must be that all animals are self-conscious because they can feel their existence. Again, you have self-consciousness if you have some sort of awareness that one of the things in your world is you. This awareness can be relational. That is, it can be knowledge in which you identify yourself as what stands in a certain relation to something else. In fact, at some level, all self-consciousness has to be relational, since what it is to be self-conscious is to be aware of standing in a certain relation to the rest of the world, to distinguish yourself from the rest of the world. Such relational knowledge is essential to action because in order to act, you have to orient yourself with the world. You have to have some sense of what your own position in it is in the world. A tiger who is standing downwind of her intended prey is not merely aware of her prey. She is also locating herself with respect to her prey in physical space, and that suggests a form of self-consciousness. A social animal who makes gestures of submission when a more dominant animal enters the scene is locating himself in a social space, and that too suggests a kind of self-consciousness. Knowing how you are related to others in a space or in a social order involves something more than simply knowing about the others. It involves knowing how you stand with regard to them, and that requires some conception of yourself. Now, of course, there is something right about what Kant says when he emphasizes that having a self involves having a kind of consciousness that is unified over time. But I believe that Kant's view is too extreme, in two ways that I will now explain. The first is that having a self is a matter of degree, a matter of how much functional unity your point of view has at a time and over time. Here is what I have in mind. When philosophers work on questions of what we interestingly call personal identity, we identify certain factors as giving a person a certain kind of continuity over time, and so making the person one person, a person with a single self enduring. These factors are those that tend to unify the person's point of view over time. We can look at learning, episodic memory, ongoing relationships, and even possibly long-term projects as among some of these factors. But these factors are also found in the lives of animals. Any animal who is conscious or sentient has a self, in the minimal sense of a point of view. There is something that it is like to be that animal at any given time. Perhaps for some very simple animals, the self, or the point of view, is something that exists at any given moment, but what the world is like for that animal at one moment does not have much influence on what the world is like for that animal at another. But we must point out that many animals can in fact learn, and that this means that what happens to them at one moment changes the way that they respond to the world at another. Animals also do other things that systematically influence and so unify their points of views over time. Animals acquire tastes, they make friends, and they even take on projects and roles. If one animal bonds with another, he may feel comfortable when he encounters that other, and in some cases even feel uncomfortable when the other is not around. If he decides to build his nest, or his dam, or his burrow in some particular spot, then that becomes the spot to return when the day's foraging is done. If he makes a mental map of a certain region to which he has been newly transported, then he can find his way around there with ease. If what happens to you, or what you do at one time, changes your point of view of the world at another time, then your self acquires an ongoing character that makes it a more unified self over time. Philosophers who think about what gives a human being a unified self over time seem to emphasize memory. But what I am talking about does not require episodic memory, the memory of particular events. An animal who is frequently beaten becomes fearful and cringing, or hostile and aggressive. An animal who is regularly treated well becomes relaxed and confident. These are not just changes in the animal's outwardly behavior. They have to reflect changes in the animal's way of experiencing the world. Ways in which what the animal is experiencing is now informed by what he experienced in the past. An animal does not need to remember specific occasions in order for this to happen. Experience is something that accumulates, constantly modifying experience itself. The animal's point of view becomes more unified in the sense that the animal responds to the same things in the same way at different times. Now, someone may wish to protest that without conscious memory, this can only be qualitative similarity, not an actual unified ongoing point of view. But actually, there is a puzzle about how even with conscious memory, one moment can be linked to another by anything more than a suitably caused qualitative similarity. This is just another philosophical problem about the nature of consciousness, which is as harsh for the human as it is for the non-human. At the same time, the animal's mind can also become much more flexible, as the animal's repertoire of responses that are appropriate to his environment accumulate. He learns to avoid more of the things that will hurt him, and he seeks out the things that he enjoys. But why does this matter to our topic? Because it changes the ways in which things can be good or bad for the animal. People like to say that animals live in the moment, and in one sense, that might be right. Unlike humans, they do not seem to spend a lot of time planning for the future or fretting about problems that may or may not arise. But in another sense, I do not think that this is true. Or perhaps what I should say is that at least for many animals, the moment itself does not live. The moment itself does not live merely in the moment, but in fact reverberates with the character of the other moments in the animal's life. The more this is true, the more an animal experiences build on themselves in forming his point of view. The more apt it becomes to identify what is good for him in larger temporal units. Any sentient animal has good experiences and bad ones, but the more that experience accumulates, the more it makes sense to think that the animal, like a human being, can have a good or a bad life, where a life is not just a string of good or bad experiences, but a kind of whole with an overall character of its own. This is because it becomes true that there is something it is like to have lived that life. Now, so far, I have proposed an account of why there is such thing as the good. There is such a thing as the good because there are creatures in this world for whom things can be good or bad. Those creatures are animals, who pursue their functional good through action. Locomotion guided by their valenced representations, or in simpler terms now, by their sentience. We human beings have a good because we are among them. We are animals ourselves. The goodness or badness of things exists in the perspective of the animals themselves, in their valenced responses to what happens to them, and in our case, also in our evaluative judgments about our own condition and what makes it good or bad. It is tethered to our perspective. But there is nothing unreal about it, for those responses and judgments concern a matter of fact. Things are good for a creature if they contribute to the well-functioning of that creature's self, with whom the creature necessarily identifies. Having a self, that is to say, a unified self I have suggested, is a matter of degree. In Chapter 4, I will discuss what sort of practical differences those differences of degree might make. But there is one more difference here that I think we need to discuss. I have been arguing that Kant's view is too extreme because he does not acknowledge that the self comes in degrees. As I have said earlier, there is another way in which Kant is too extreme. The process that I have just been talking about are ones that can happen more or less passively, without much active participation on the part of the animal herself. One of the distinctive features of being human, or so I am about to argue, is that we might play an active and sometimes even a conscious role in determining the unity and coherence of our minds, our lives, and ultimately of ourselves and our identity. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant tells us that the importance of the idea of I rests in the fact that we must be able to attach an I think to all of our thoughts. As I have argued elsewhere, although Kant himself never quite says this, a similar point holds for actions, to which we must be able to attach an I do. Part of the point here is that we claim responsibility for our own thoughts and actions, and part of what taking that responsibility involves is an active endeavor to make them coherent. Claiming my thoughts as mine, as things that I think, is pledging myself to make them fit together. So we human beings actively try to form a coherent conception of the world as a whole, one which enables us to track the ways in which everything is related to everything else, causally, spatially, and logically. The unity here is a functional unity. It enables me to find my way around in the world and to use what is in it more effectively. If my views contradict each other, then I ought change them, for they cannot both be things that I think. And although I think rational beings play a much more active role in unifying themselves than the other animals, I do not mean to imply that they play no active role at all. An animal that is puzzled about or surprised by something in his environment and, say, moves closer to check it out, is probably motivated by the desire to ensure that it is not a threat, or something like that, not by the desire to unify his conception of the world. Or, perhaps I should say that even if he is simply curious, the evolutionary purpose of his behavior is to make sure that it is not a threat. Nevertheless, as a result of his curiosity, he is still in fact unifying his conception of the world. In a similar way, claiming my actions as mine, as things that I do, is pledging myself to making them expressions of coherent principles and to fitting them together into coherent plans. The unity here is again a functional unity. It enables me to live my life without undercutting the effectiveness of my own actions in achieving and respecting the values I hold most dear. The way in which human beings are self-conscious makes self-constitution, or the unification of the thinking self, the knowing self, and the acting self, into a more or less self-conscious project. Next, in Chapter 3, I will explain why I think Kant is right about the active role human beings play in their own self-constitution. But my point is now twofold. First, this does not mean that there is no functional unity to the minds and the selves of the other animals. A certain amount of functional unity is given by their instincts, and some comes naturally in other ways. So the difference between human beings and the other animals is not that the other animals do not have a self-consciousness or selves. It is that we human beings play, perhaps, an active and responsible role in constituting ourselves, our own minds, and maybe our identities. But in Chapter 3, we will take a more in-depth look at the question of what it is to be different as a human being. All right, so that is the first 2 chapters. So I think we'll put an end to it there, because it's pretty late. That was a longer chapter. And then we can reconvene at another time. I guess Beyond and I don't know if there's a poll going now or what, but we'll do a poll later on about when people want to reconvene for another reading. At this point, if anyone has any questions that were like unresolved by the chapters we were reading, I can stick around for a little bit. I haven't actually eaten food today, so I do want to go cook, but but I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to answer some questions and clear some things up. One thing is that I will point out that some of the questions that you're likely to have right now are just in virtue of the fact that we only read half of the first part, of which there are 3, and that in many cases she's going to explain these things further on. The other thing is that, again, this is not a book for like lay people. This is like a philosophical manuscript. It's meant for like other working philosophers to read and to digest. So there is a little bit of like inside baseball or even novel terms. And so if you didn't fully get it this go around, I'd recommend going through the book on your own time. Or if you guys want, I can do another read through of certain sections later where I can go a little bit more in depth or like do more commentary, or we can do more of a back and forth. But yeah, I think at this point it's good to note that she's trying to be as charitable to the like historical Kantian notion and the anti-vegan notion as possible. That's the purpose of like this part, is to really try and see what we can rescue of non-veganism or speciesism. And her sort of problem is that it doesn't seem like there's much that we can rescue, no matter how hard we try, because doing so, in her view, requires us to just like forget that, as it turns out, animals have a lot of the features that are important to us. The second part, the like very technical part that will serve as like an introduction to Kant for a lot of you, is much more philosophically abstract. If you tune out for those ones, I'd recommend coming back for part 3 at least, because part 3 is where she goes through her prescriptive ethics. So she starts talking about how this stuff like plays into the world. And it doesn't actually require having a thorough reading of part 1 and part 2. You can just assume some of the things that she's mentioning and assume that she argues for them properly, and then sort of conclude what she's saying. The utility there is that, again, a lot of the philosophical discussion regarding non-humans on Discord especially is very consequentialist in nature, and she will deliver arguments that probably to a lot of you like will be like unacceptable. She has like a much more categorical and like much more demanding view. Like, just as a spoiler, like she's like a complete eliminativist about animal testing, which has like, in my mind, like one of the most like potent and perhaps even like beautiful deliveries I've seen in like a paper anywhere. And then she also has like views on how we should treat predator species that I've been trying to cite to people as like a way to think about some of the things that like Avi, for example, present in AY, amongst other things. But yeah, just to like wrap up, definitely like come back for the next half of part 1. Try and show up for part 2, especially if you've never like dabbled into Kant, because I think it's good to understand the criticisms of consequentialism and the ways in which deontology might actually be rescuable. And then if you could do anything with this book, the most important part is to show up for part 3, where she talks very emphatically about what we should do, and in fact what our obligations to creatures are, which I guess is another motivation I haven't mentioned. Is she doesn't just see how we should treat animals as like a negative rights thing, right? She thinks that there are in fact positive rights and obligations that we have to creatures other than ourselves, and so she argues for that as well. It's not intended for lay people, Zaza. It is intended for like the philosophical audience. It's probably easier to understand than like some like kind of like severe like metaphysics or some kind of severe logic, but it does use like inside baseball terms. So sometimes I can understand how it would be hard. The other thing too is like I recommend like not being like super like cocky about your understanding. Like it might sound like it makes sense in the moment, but don't feel bad if you like wake up tomorrow and you feel like you can't remember anything she said or anything like that. Like definitely feel free to reread the book. It's worth it. The other thing is too is I've linked lectures and stuff. So if you want more of her content before we go in, it'll be a bit spoilery because she has further developed the ideas that I linked. You can also go watch her lectures and interviews and stuff where she talks about a lot of this. But yeah, that was actually a pretty crazy turnout. I think we had like almost 30 people at some points. Hopefully I didn't put you all to sleep. And if you have any questions or any like commentary, put them in the book discussion over like the course of the next little bit until we read again. And I'll try to get back to them. Another person you can go to is Arco. Arco's read this book as well, so he's another source of info. But it'd be nice to keep all of it in the book discussion. Yeah. Anyways, thanks for showing up. That was kind of cool.